Well, hello again, and welcome back to the Book of Revelation from an Historicist View, Part 2, The Plot. Last time we discovered that there were a great number of respected church authorities who saw the Book of Revelation as already unfolding, and in fact very few who thought it was to be viewed as on hold until some future time. Well, today we're going to examine the plot and hopefully unravel some of the confusion as to the timing of the events. That timing sets the historicist view apart from the futurist view. I'm excited about our study today. I hope you are as well. Sometimes it's helpful to determine what something isn't in order to determine what it is. The plot of the book of Revelation isn't what the prophets saw. It's a bit like watching or trying to understand a complex movie by starting at the end. It's best if you rewind a tad in order to focus on and follow the plot. So, what did the prophets see? Well, chiefly speaking, all of the prophets foresaw the coming 4 Gentile kingdoms that would rule the world, and more importantly, Israel, because of their rejection of God. Nebuchadnezzar's infamous dream of the statue is where we get our first real look at those kingdoms and how the scriptures portray them using symbolism. Now, Daniel's interpretation of that statue in chapter 2 leaves no doubt as to the meaning of these symbols. You, O Nebuchadnezzar, are the head of gold. And then he proceeds to tell him that 3 inferior kingdoms will follow after him. The breast and arms of silver were Media Persia, the belly and thighs of bronze was Grecia, and the legs of iron with feet part iron, part clay was an as yet unnamed 4th kingdom that would subdue all things under its feet. And Daniel also receives his own vision of 4 beasts and also interprets that for us, showing us that the winged lion was Babylon, the bear standing on one side was Persia, the winged 4-headed leopard being Grecia, and again an unnamed 4th kingdom that was a dreadful and terrible beast. But there are others besides Daniel who see these Gentile kingdoms on the horizon. Joel, in chapter 1, verse 4, he speaks of 4 different types, some say stages of locusts, which will invade the land and destroy the crops, bringing famine and God's people to the brink of destruction. He speaks of the palmer worm, the locust, the cankerworm, and the caterpillar. Now, scholars still debate today whether or not an actual locust infestation occurred, but many from the historicist camp believe he was seeing ahead 200 years to the time of the exile of Israel. Point of fact, later in that same chapter, Joel describes an invading army whose appearance is, quote, as of the appearance of horses and horsemen. That certainly sounds like Revelation language to me. And I think Joel seals the interpretation in verse 17 of the next chapter by saying, the priests cry out, spare thy people, Yahweh, and give not thine heritage to reproach, that the heathen should rule over them. In fact, is it possible that Joel was seeing the coming Gentile invaders? Certainly, Albert Barnes, the Bible commentator of the 1830s, suggests that, quote, actual locusts were very likely one of the scourges intended by the prophet. They certainly were not the whole, but pictured others fiercer, more desolating, more overwhelming. Yet, as in God's wisdom, what is said generally is often fulfilled specially. So here, there were 4 great invaders which in succession wasted Judah, the Assyrian, Chaldean, Macedonian, and Roman. Now we also see Hosea, who lived about 760 to 720 BC. He prophesied against Israel regarding their captivity by the Assyrians and Babylonians. And Isaiah, who foretold of the coming Assyrians, Babylonians, and even Cyrus the Persian. In Jeremiah, who lived around 650 to 570 BC, He was known as the Weeping Prophet, and he gave the final appeal to Israel before Babylon's conquest of them. And Ezekiel, who was a contemporary of Jeremiah, he foresaw the destruction and restoration of Jerusalem all the way to the millennial temple. So we see that the prophets warned Israel about the coming exile from the 4 Gentile kingdoms. Next, let's take a closer look at these 4 Gentile kingdoms that would rule over Israel. We'll see that most of what the prophets foretold has already been fulfilled. Starting with Babylon from 607 to 537 BC. It's a period of exactly 70 years, which most Bible scholars believe fulfilled the prophecy of Jeremiah chapter 25, verse 11, which stated, "This whole land shall be a desolation and shall serve the king of Babylon 70 years. 1 year for each sabbatical year that Israel failed to keep, not letting the land rest." And then we remember Babylon being associated with the winged lion. Next, we see the Medes Persian Empire from 538 to 332 BC. We can remember the great story where Cyrus diverts the Euphrates River and, guided by a couple of deserters, marched by a dry riverbed right into the city while the Babylonians were holding a feast to their gods, using the vessels from the temple at Jerusalem. God showed favor to his people during this time, allowing some of them to return home and restore the temple under Cyrus. And we remember Persia being associated with the bear raised on one side. Grecia from 333 to 146 BC. We can remember Alexander the Great conquering Persia after Persia's second attempt to annex Greece. But Alexander didn't live long. He died at the early age of 32 years old, and his kingdom was divided into 4 parts and given to his 4 generals, hence Grecia being associated with the 4-headed leopard. Now, between Grecia and Rome, the land enjoyed a slight reprieve when in 140 BC, Judas Maccabee led a revolt against Antiochus Epiphanes. We remember him as a type of the Antichrist, certainly bringing devastation upon Jerusalem and its inhabitants. This is also the time that the Hasmonean dynasty was established in Judea, at least until Herod the Great assumed the throne of Judah with Roman support, bringing that century-long dynasty to an end. Now, Rome, the as yet unnamed kingdom, we now know in hindsight, being the Roman Empire, began in earnest at 63 BC, and I have it going to 612 AD for a purpose. We know that in 456 AD, the Western Roman Empire is going to fall, but Israel itself proper, the Holy Land, is still under the purview, if you will, of the Eastern Roman Empire until the 5th trumpet, which we will discuss in ensuing videos. We know the Roman occupation of the Greek world was established after the Battle of Actium in 31 BC, in which Augusta defeated Cleopatra and the Roman general Mark Antony. And we know that Rome was associated with that 4th dreadful and terrible beast with iron teeth. Indeed, we see that everything that the prophets saw, or at least the majority of what they saw, came to be fulfilled even before Messiah's first coming. Now, Nebuchadnezzar's dream gives a little more information, if you will, than Daniel's vision. His dream shows that that 4th beast is weakened as that iron mixed with clay, and that the stone, which is cut out without hands, strikes the image upon the feet, toppling the whole thing. And that's really an indication of it striking it during the time that it's being weakened. That stone then becomes a great mountain, filling the whole earth. And I happen to believe that Messiah, who was born as the 4th kingdom of Rome was getting underway, is the one who delivers to John the details of that final kingdom. Its death, its reincarnation, its sway over the entire earth and God's people, and its final demise upon his return. Now, I believe that getting Daniel right is key to getting Revelation correct. Without the proper view of the prophets, but particularly Daniel, some confusion is bound to happen. Let me show you what I mean. In the futurist view of the book of Revelation, based on Daniel's 70 weeks, a future 7-year tribulation period is placed between the rapture and the Lord's second coming. Now, I know there are some variations, but this is a pretty straightforward interpretation of the view. Many of you may already be familiar with the scenario from the novels and movies left behind, as I said before. But I want you to notice that even in this view, Daniel's 69 weeks are recognized as having already been fulfilled before Messiah's first coming. Next, though, they insert a gap, not to be confused with the erroneous gap theory of the book of Genesis, where they ignore or at least overlook the last 2,000 years of unprecedented world history. And then, of course, lastly, the famous 7-year tribulation just before Messiah's return. But is this view supported by the scriptures? I do not believe it is. And to understand why, we have to go back to the book of Daniel and his 70 weeks. Now, in order to understand where this idea of 70 weeks comes from, we're going to look at Daniel chapter 9, verses 24 through 27. It's a lot, but we'll take it one verse at a time, beginning in verse 24, where the angel says, 70 weeks are determined upon thy people, Daniel, and upon thy holy city, Jerusalem, to do 6 things: to finish the transgression, to make an end of sins, to make reconciliation for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up the vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy. Now, the next thing the angel tells Daniel is that these 70 weeks will be broken up into 3 groups of weeks: 7 weeks, 62 weeks, and the final week. There are your 70 weeks. And I'll remind you that from the futurist view, the 69 weeks have already been fulfilled, and that final week is placed in the future as a 7-year tribulation. Now next, in verse 25, the angel tells Daniel when the countdown should begin. Know therefore and understand, from the going forth of the commandment to restore and to rebuild Jerusalem unto the Messiah the Prince shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. The street shall be built again, and the wall, even in troublous times. So once the commandment to restore and rebuild Jerusalem and its wall goes out, the countdown begins, and we'll discuss that in the next slide. Then we look at verse 26, which tells us, and after 62 weeks shall Messiah be cut off, but not for himself. And the people of the prince that shall come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary, and the end thereof shall be with a flood. And unto the end of the war, desolations are determined. So we see that after that second group of weeks, the 62 Shabuah, or the 434 years, Messiah will be cut off, but not for himself. And lastly, verse 27 tells us that he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week, and in the midst of the week he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease, and for the overspreading of abominations he shall make it desolate, even until the consummation, and that determined shall be poured upon the desolate. So we see that finally this last week, Messiah is cut off, and we're going to find out who it is that confirms the covenant with many. So a very quick recap. The first verse tells us that there are 70 weeks to accomplish all of these things for Daniel's people and Jerusalem. The 25th verse tells us when that begins. The 26th verse says that sometime after the 62 weeks, or that second period, the Messiah is cut off. And then finally, the verse 27 tells us when he dies. Now, the Historicist View makes verse 27 all about the Messiah, whereas the Futurist View makes half of it, at least, about the Antichrist. More about that in a bit. All right, well, we're going to need to revisit Daniel's 70 weeks in order to properly understand Revelation. If we can account for all 70 weeks having been fulfilled, and that's what the Historicist View does, then we can show that there is no justifiable reason to propose a future 7-year period. So let's begin with the word weeks itself. It's the English translation, but it's better seen as 70 sevens, because the Hebrew word is Shabuah. And Shabuah literally means sevened, that is, a week, but specifically of years. So we could actually say 70 7-year periods, or 490 years. Next, we're told that the 490 years will begin with the first group of weeks, or 7 Shabuah, 49 years, when the commandment goes forth to restore and to build Jerusalem, including the street and wall being built, even in troublous times. Now, many people want to make this the decree by Cyrus to rebuild the temple, but it's Nehemiah who tells the story of rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem, and historians have placed the decree ordering that restoration in the 20th year of the Persian king Artaxerxes Longimanus in 454 BC. Agreeing with that is the British Methodist theologian and Bible commentator of 1817, Adam Clarke, when he says, quote, "To the first period of 7 weeks, the restoration and repairing of Jerusalem are referred. And so long were Ezra and Nehemiah employed in restoring the sacred constitutions and civil establishments of the Jews. For this work lasted 49 years after the commission was given by Artaxerxes." Be sure to look in the description area of this video if you want to follow the link to Mr. Clarke's commentary on Daniel. If we add those 49 years of restoration to our start date, that brings us to 405 BC. Next, Daniel is told that there's going to be another period of 62 Shabuah, or 434 years, before Messiah the Prince shows up. Adding that to our timeline brings us to 29 AD. Now, most scholars recognize this as the probable year that Christ began his public ministry. The angel continues, after 62 Shabuah, after the second period of weeks, the Messiah will be cut off, but not for himself. He will confirm the covenant with many for 1 week. Now, you may have already guessed where this is going, and you'd be correct if you think the historicist camp makes this Messiah who confirms the covenant with many. The Hebrew word there for confirm actually means to strengthen or to make strong. He's not making a covenant, but confirming it or strengthening the covenant. And I would argue that Messiah is confirming the new covenant found in Jeremiah chapter 31, verses 31 through 33. Perhaps someday I'll make a video about that subject, but suffice it to say that this idea that it's Christ confirming this covenant and not the Antichrist as espoused by the futurist view, it's supported by the angel's very next words. And in the midst of the week, he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease. So you might ask, how? How is that possible, that Messiah causes the sacrifice and oblation to cease? Well, it just so happens that the middle of that week corresponds precisely with Messiah's crucifixion, which nullified any further atoning sacrifices. They are no longer not only not necessary, they're no longer accepted in heaven. And then if we finish out that last week, it brings us to approximately 36 AD, and we'll consider the purpose of those years momentarily. But let's wrap up this last Shabuah, this final 7 years, by saying, according to the historicist view, this was all fulfilled by Christ himself. So the question begs answering, how is it that the futurist view attributes these verses to the Antichrist in the future? And I believe the answer is this small ellipsis right here. I inserted it in place of part of verse 26 to save some space, but here is exactly what you see when you see the whole verse. It begins with Messiah shall be cut off, but not for himself. And then you go to this insert, and the people of the prince that shall come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary, and the end thereof shall be with a flood, and unto the end of the war desolations are determined. And then it picks back up with, and he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week. Now, this verse right here, or this phrase, prince that shall come, well, it's ambiguous at best and confusing at worst. And futurist proponents make the next pronoun he refer to this man incorrectly. They make it the Antichrist who is confirming the covenant. But it isn't the Antichrist. According to the Historicist View, it is the Messiah who confirms the covenant. And for just a second witness, if you will, I offer up an excerpt from Bible Hermeneutics, Stack Exchange, the author being Christian Gedge. It's an online forum site for professors and theologians. But Mr. Gedge says, the prophecy's real intent is the central person of Christ, not Antichrist. And the prince who was to come refers to Titus, who came 40 years after the weeks were over. Shortly afterward, the other prince, Titus the Roman, came and destroyed the temple altogether. He goes on to say that, however, the destruction is attributed to the people of the prince, not to the prince himself. Such a distinction would be superfluous if it were not for the fact that Titus had instructed his troops to preserve the temple, but they disobeyed orders and torched it anyway. The people of the prince did it. So to recap, the prince that shall come turns out to be, according to the Historicist View, Roman official named Titus, and his people, probably the soldiers who disobeyed orders and torched the temple in 70 AD. Okay, we're going to take one last close-up look at this final week, the final Shabuah or 7-year period. Can we really prove that Messiah fulfilled this week? I believe that we can. But first we must remember that after the 62-week period, Daniel tells us that the Messiah is cut off, but not for himself. And in the middle of a week, he confirms the covenant and causes the sacrifice and oblation to cease. So that's our backdrop. Well, to find the middle of anything, you divide it into 2 equal parts. So we have the first 3.5 years and the last 3.5 years for a total of 7 years. And really, the most obvious question right off the bat is, what would have been the natural fulfillment right after Messiah shows up in 29 AD? And the answer is his ministry, of course. And I offer an excerpt from the Center for Biblical Studies at Midwestern Seminary. Actually, the article I'm taking it from is entitled April the 3rd, AD 33, Why We Believe We Can Know the Exact Date Jesus Died. Let's look at that excerpt. It says that if Jesus, as the Gospels seem to indicate, began his ministry not long after John, then based on the calculations above, the earliest date for Jesus' baptism would be in late AD 28. However, it is more probable to place it sometime in the first half of the year AD 29, because a few months probably elapsed between the beginning of John's ministry and that of Jesus. And the year AD 30 is the latest possible date. This agrees with Luke's mention that Jesus, when he began his ministry, was about 30 years of age. If he was born in 6 or 5 BC, as is most likely, Jesus would have been approximately 32 to 34 years old in late AD 28 until AD 30, which falls well within the range of him being about 30 years of age. The next obvious question would be, what about the final 3.5 years? Have they been fulfilled? And if you were with me on part 1, Great Minds, you may remember that I said Francisco Ribera, the Catholic Jesuit priest and originator of the futurist view, argued that only the letters to the 7 churches were historically fulfilled. The rest was waiting for some future time. He actually was waiting for a 3.5 year tribulation. But the Historicist View, and I concur, believes that the 3.5 years of the final Shabuah have also been fulfilled, and that by the church's history as it was getting underway. And I offer another excerpt from the Gospel Coalition and the article entitled First 20 Years, What Happened to the Church Immediately After Jesus Died. After the murder of Stephen and the church's exile from Jerusalem, Saul, whom we know as Paul, rode to Damascus to continue persecuting Christians. Instead, he found the risen Lord on the way. Saul's conversion sent shock waves across the Jewish landscape of Israel. In Damascus, he who had persecuted became the persecuted, and Paul had to flee the city. He ended up going to Arabia, quite possibly Mount Sinai, for 3 years before returning to Damascus. He then returned to Jerusalem. Just years earlier, Paul had stood by while watching the murder of Stephen in Jerusalem. Now he returned to the city and preached Christ. The mob attempted to murder him, so he fled to Tarsus. It would take another 11 years before Paul would start his missionary journeys. Well, the only thing left to discover about this final week, if the first 3.5 years was Jesus' ministry, and the final 3.5 years was the fledgling new church getting off the ground. We just have to decide what happened in the middle of the week, and it's so obvious. Christ, Messiah, was cut off, but not for himself. He made an end of sins. He made reconciliation for iniquity. He brought in everlasting righteousness. He sealed up the vision and prophecy. And he anointed the most holy. He accomplished everything that the 70 weeks were intended to accomplish in that final week. And he did all of this by his death. He strengthened the covenant of Jeremiah 31, the new covenant. His death caused the sacrifice and oblation to cease as they were no longer accepted in heaven. Yes, the Historicist View has all of this glorious history, all 70 weeks, fulfilled for Daniel's people in Jerusalem. It would just be another 40 plus years that the temple would be burned to the ground and tens of thousands of Jews slaughtered. But the church will have grown and the gospel will have spread in spite of all that went before it and in spite of what is yet to come at the opening of the first seal of Revelation. So, I advise that you leave the left behind mindset behind. The 70th week of Daniel was fulfilled by Messiah's ministry, death, and the fierce persecution of the fledgling church by Paul and his conversion. There is no 7-year period that needs to be fulfilled. Futurism and even preterism, the belief that it's all been fulfilled, were derived from Jesuit writings whose counter-Reformation efforts were aimed at opposing historicism that said the Antichrist was the office of the papacy or the power of the Roman Catholic Church. They were not popular until the late 19th and 20th centuries after the sensation of the Left Behind series. And perhaps the most gleaming and ardent endorsement of this view comes from the book of Revelation itself, from chapter 1, verse 3. Blessed is he that reads, and they that hear the words of this prophecy, and keep those things which are written therein, for the time is at hand. This so starkingly contrasts with what Daniel was told in chapter 12. Go thy way, Daniel, for the words are closed up and sealed till the time of the end. Not so with Jesus' revelation to John. The time is now, John. The time is now. Perhaps you remember me telling you that as I began to reread Revelation over and over. It didn't take long, and I thought maybe we were somewhere between the two white horses. In my thinking, the two white horses of Revelation act as bookends. We're going to see that Messiah's first coming, though not necessarily depicted as being on a white horse, really could be viewed that way, especially given the symbolism of the first seal. But regardless, it certainly is responsible for what the historicist view promotes as the first seal. The 84 years of Roman peace, or Pax Romana, under the 5 good emperors. It really allowed the gospel to flourish like never before. Surprise, surprise, that this is not the Antichrist either. And by the time we get to the last bowl judgment in chapter 16, we're told of an earthquake that rivals all earthquakes, quote, as has never been seen since men were on the earth. But interestingly enough, the very next event, as far as action, is another rider on a white horse who is called Faithful and True. Now, there are a couple chapters between that last bowl judgment and the next rider, but they talk about the false religion of Babylon and show us what it looks like when it falls. I believe all that will become clear as we progress through the book. So, what is Revelation's plot if it's not the slice of history that the prophets focused on? Remember, they prophesied of the events leading up to Christ's first coming. But it's going to be Messiah himself who reveals the details to John of the events leading to his second coming. It is going to be Messiah's revelation to John that is the last 2,000 years of history. We would call that church history, with his first coming and his second coming acting as bookends. Well, this concludes part 2 of the plot of Revelation. Next time on the Historicist View, we are going to explore the literary elements such as the setting of Revelation, and we'll discuss whether or not the Antichrist is a global leader. We're also going to look at the symbolism of the book and maybe figure out whether the earth is really going to reel to and fro. And we will discover patterns in the book that help us to understand all that's going on. You know, it's interesting, but a lot of people think that there are only 7 judgments and they're just described in 3 different ways, or maybe that all of the judgments are happening at the same time and or overlapping. But, you know, there really are repeated patterns that actually help us to match up the historical events. Revelation is truly a complex book, not because it's mysterious or out of our reach, but just like the way that our Lord taught parables, you really have to be seeking and kind of find the gems that have always been out there, out in the open the whole time. I hope that you'll be able to join me next time for part 3, the book of Revelation, the greatest literary work of all time. But until then, happy studying and shalom.